friends. Thanks for joining us here for episode 8 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. You can subscribe at our Substack page, of course, robbreakenridge.ca, which is where this podcast is hosted. You can also listen and subscribe Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and where you get your podcasts. We've also got our YouTube channel you can check out as well. Plenty to get to on the show here. A couple of really interesting interviews for you on this episode. We'll get into all things energy, pipelines, government policy as we chat with Dennis McConaghy. He's a former top executive at TC Energy. He's also the author of multiple books on Canada's energy debate and energy future. Also, it's been 5 years now since Gabriel Wortman murdered 22 people across 2 days in northern Nova Scotia, the largest mass murder in Canada's history. Paul Palango is an author and investigative journalist. He's written extensively about the massacre and the way it was handled and investigated by authorities. He's the author of a new book out this week. It's called Anatomy of a Cover-Up, The Truth About the RCMP and the Nova Scotia Massacres. We'll hear from Paul Palango coming up later on. But first, some news to get to, and this follows on the heels of what we talked about on the last podcast and the announcement from Prime Minister Mark Carney that he's got his new Building Canada Act. He's going to identify projects that are in the national interest, and those projects will be fast-tracked with an aim of getting them approved within 2 years. Now, that could potentially include pipelines, and clearly Alberta is hoping that it does. But at the same time, Mark Carney also suggested that if there's opposition to any project, that they wouldn't be able to go ahead with it, whether that be opposition from a province or opposition from First Nations, which is interesting because ultimately the federal government does have the authority to approve these projects. Provinces don't have a veto, and even though there's a constitutional obligation for the feds to negotiate and consult in good faith with First Nations, they don't have a veto either. Now, as far as a pipeline to the West Coast is concerned, BC's premier has suggested he's not the obstacle, as much as Alberta's premier has said she's going to try to convince him of the need for a new pipeline. But David Eby says there's no proposal. It's all hypothetical, that's the issue, that no one's stepping forward to propose such a plan. But there is going to be a need for added pipeline capacity, and going to the West Coast is the most obvious option. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has talked about, at least in the abstract, of bringing back Northern Gateway pipeline project or something similar to it, maybe one that runs to Prince Rupert as opposed to Kitimat. But now it seems like something more concrete is starting to form here. And Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who spoke this week at the Global Energy Show in Calgary, says very soon there is going to be an actual proposal that will be put before the Prime Minister.
Well, we're talking to all of the pipeline proponents, anyone who has had success in building a pipeline in Canada and has an interest in perhaps coming together as a consortium, or if one emerges as being a principal proponent, then we'll be interested in talking to them too. But we know that it's a chicken and egg problem, that no one's going to come forward with a project without some guarantee that's going to be approved. And so what we're going to do is walk with that group to test out the 2-year timeline and see if we can get on the project list. So I feel like the Prime Minister, I want to take him at his word that he wants to operate in good faith. So we're going to operate in good faith, and we hope that we'll be able to have more to tell you in a few weeks.
Okay, so if this does materialize, it is going to change the conversation dramatically, because this would no longer be a hypothetical. We'd be talking about an actual project that's being proposed. So what is going to be the reaction from BC? What is going to be the reaction from First Nations? And ultimately, what is going to be the reaction from the federal government and from Prime Minister Mark Carney? Now, Danielle Smith acknowledging that there is likely going to have to be some trade-offs here. And we've already heard talk of this grand bargain. And here's Premier Smith this week, again, speaking with reporters at the Global Energy Show, saying this Pathways Alliance, this massive carbon capture project, if that's built in conjunction with this pipeline, that could be the trade-off.
That's certainly what we're proposing to him, because think of it this way. The Pathways project could be anywhere from 10 to 20 billion when it's fully built out. At the moment, that's 100% cost, because there's no revenue associated with that. Now, if you couple it with a 1 million barrel per day pipeline, well, that allows you $20 billion worth of revenue year after year after year for the lifetime of that project. All of a sudden, a $10 to $20 billion cost to decarbonize, it looks a lot more attractive when you have a new source of revenue. So that's what we pitched the Prime Minister on, yes.
Okay, a little bit more here from Alberta's Premier speaking with the reporters. And here's Danielle Smith saying, look, as much as they've been kind of frustrated or impatient at times with the federal government, she says there is still a lot of opportunity here to work with the Carney government. There's a lot of room for compromise. There's a lot of room for progress.
Well, I guess the question would be, what does he need to do, right? What is the minimum he needs to do? And I can tell you that there are ways that we can find accommodation. He has to say that he's not having the emissions cap, and that means not bringing it in. So I think that not acting would be a positive move. On the issue of the tanker ban, maybe we come to an agreement that if all roads lead to Port of Prince Rupert, just carve out Port of Prince Rupert so that you can continue to protect the rest of the coast. I can live with that. We've already announced that we cannot see an increase in the industrial carbon price going up to 170, that 95, what we've heard from the industry, is enough. Will he accept that? And if he can accept that, then I think we have some common ground. So I'm prepared to go through these one at a time to see what the common ground might be. And so we've put a table together. I have Rajan Sawhney and Jason Nixon as my two ministerial leads on that, my Chief of Staff, Rob Anderson. We've got our Deputy Minister of Energy and my Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and we're asking for the federal government to put together an equal table. And then we'll go through these one at a time. And hopefully in the fall session, we'll be able to make some progress.
She was asked about just how serious the separatist threat in Alberta is, or how real the frustration is here in Alberta. And Premier Danielle Smith warning that it's not something the Prime Minister should ignore or take for granted.
I hope the Prime Minister doesn't want to test it because I take it seriously. I have never seen separatist sentiment be as high as it is right now. We've done our own polling, and we've seen numbers as high as 37%. You look historically, I don't know if it's ever been that high. But again, I've also seen it dissipate when Ottawa addresses the legitimate concerns Alberta has. And I'm not kidding that the 9 demands are my short list. I know that there are other tensions that we have with the federal government, but a lot can get resolved when you have the means, because people have good paying jobs, and you also have the revenues to be able to address some of the social pressures. So I think that for our sake and for the country's sake, I can't imagine that there will be another project on the national list that will generate as much revenue, as much GDP, as many high-paying jobs as a bitumen pipeline to the coast. So that will be my pitch, and I hope that he is willing to work with us on it. He seems to be giving us the indication that he is, but we'll know for sure in a few more months.
Okay, some comments this week there from Alberta Premier Danielle Smith speaking at the Global Energy Show in Calgary. So we'll see what comes in the weeks ahead here. Obviously, the federal government needs to pass this legislation that will open up this new avenue potentially for faster approval of big projects that are deemed to be in the national interest. And of course, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith alluding to an actual concrete pipeline proposal that we can expect to see in the coming weeks. So stay tuned on that. Like I said, we got a lot to get to on this episode of the podcast. Coming up in a moment here, we'll talk more about pipelines, energy demand, what it all means for Alberta, and of course, how we navigate federal priorities and federal policy, especially as it concerns net zero. We'll hear from Dennis McConaghy. He's a former top executive at TC Energy, has written extensively about the energy debate and Canada's energy future. This is the Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, plenty to discuss with our next guest. He has more than 30 years of experience in the Canadian energy sector, including time as a former top executive at what is now TC Energy. Dennis McConaghy is the author of multiple books on Canada's energy debate and energy future. His most recent is Carbon Change, Canada on the Brink of Decarbonization. Dennis McConaghy, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Rob.
Like I say, lots to talk about. It was interesting this week at the Global Energy Show in Calgary here. You had the Secretary General of OPEC talking about energy demand, oil demand continuing to rise, maybe well into 2050 perhaps even. So as we talk about where things are going in Canada, what's your sense of overall demand trends here?
Well, I really have just 2 points to make about that. And of course, what the OPEC official was putting out publicly is something that I think many of us have believed was actually going to be the case. And there's really 2 reasons. the affordability of hydrocarbons still outweighs other energy options. Secondly, it's very difficult to actually substitute certain applications that hydrocarbons have that really erode this fundamental world global demand for hydrocarbons. And, people in North America tend to think about, the indispensability of hydrocarbons for air travel, plastics, in some applications related to personal transportation. Yet in other parts of the world, something as fundamental as still using coal to provide basic heat, process heat, is still, part of what is driving this demand. So, it's a function of its indispensability, and secondly, its affordability. And that latter point, I think, has been more demonstrated, especially across the developed economies over the last 5 years, where people were coming out of events like not just Paris, but the Glasgow conference, that we were really committed to decarbonization. But lo and behold, the world evidences that it can't actually afford it. And moreover, as Spain just illustrated, there are risks, substantial risks to trying to electrify an economy based on a market share or a supply share for renewables that gets too high, and that you have moments where, the basic integrity of your electricity grid is put into question unless you have sufficient backup in the form of natural gas generation. So in total, none of this should be surprising, and it creates a very special dilemma for this country of Canada, given especially who is currently the Prime Minister.
Right. And we are at a bit of a moment in time here, because, this is a government, and some of this Mark Carney has inherited, the more aggressive sort of net zero targets. But at the same time, there's a need to meet demand. There's conversations now about, possible new pipelines. So what's your sense of which way the government is leaning here?
Well, first of all, Mark Carney, independent of what he inherited, has had a long history of being committed to the notion of net zero. He was a special UN envoy to try to advance the idea that the financial community would stop lending to hydrocarbon companies across the globe as part of an effort to advance this energy transition. So unlike the former prime minister, who, was hardly steeped in, an academic or scientific background, Carney comes to this certainly from the interface between the financial world and the efforts to try to advance decarbonization. And so this is a personal conviction for him as much as it is an inherited policy. So and of course, Mark Carney is a man of legitimate credentials. So he's actually a more formidable, a more formidable adversary for the interests of Alberta. And let me just make this point. It's not so much how does Canada meet its own energy demands as it is, does Canada fully capture the export opportunity that is represented by hydrocarbons? And this really comes down to two places. and they all are at odds with some of the fundamental intentions of his government. So what are we talking about? In the case of oil, Canada, I think, still has, and when you say Canada in oil, you're really talking almost exclusively about Alberta. We have the ability to expand existing oil production up potentially over the next 10 years, I'm confident, towards another 1 million barrels a day. That's on top of the 5 million that we are already producing. So how does that 5 million break down? 4 million of it is oil sands production. The last other 1 million is our residual conventional production. To be able to add another 1 million barrels to that would be a significant contribution to a country that has just spent the last 10 years with zero GDP growth, largely because of its unwillingness to fully embrace the infrastructure required to accelerate Canadian oil production. So on the table is a real simple economic choice. Is Canada going to fully commit itself to that export opportunity in the context of a world that cannot do without these hydrocarbons, and in the context of a world that, if we don't choose to capture these markets for our heavy oil, other countries will, and they will do with no regard for the kind of climate policy that Mark Carney, I think, still intends to impose in Alberta. So let's be really specific on the oil side. Three things would have to that are on the table, and possibly a fourth one. The first is, of course, the issue of emissions caps and how those could ever be met without contracting production. Number two is the existence of this federal statute known as the Impact Assessment Act, which is basically the statute that you would have to use in order to get any new infrastructure, a new oil pipeline, built, and the significant risks that statute represents to any private sector capital that would want to advance such a project. And then thirdly is the West Coast tanker moratorium, a moratorium that would apply as much to Kitimat as it would to Prince Rupert. And then you can add a fourth one, which is, Carney's most recent invocation is this idea that I'm okay with a new pipeline for oil as long as the oil is decarbonized. And of course, that actually means, on its face perhaps, that Alberta would have to contemplate applying carbon capture and sequestration technology, CCS technology, to all of the related emissions of its oil sands production, a technology that in my mind is approaching like a $300 a ton carbon tax on that production, and still expecting Alberta and Canada to actually be competitive in world markets. It is another way of actually saying that we don't want to, as a government, we don't want this growth in the Alberta oil sands. In fact, we want it going in the other direction because it's antithetical to the whole notion of net zero. So all this, so that's just on the oil side. On the gas side, of course, again, it is an issue of LNG. The place where Alberta and Canada, and it's a more national thing in respect of natural gas because there are significant parts of Canada's shale oil or shale gas endowment that exists in Northeast BC. So the opportunity is kind of there for this country. Are we going to build on the one world scale facility that is in place at Kitimat, the LNG Canada facility that's led by Shell, Asian partners, DC Energy being the entity that has built the pipeline that has basically connected to from the Alberta gathering system all the way to the port of Kitimat? Does Canada build on that opportunity? Does it actually then take on potentially the idea of another gas LNG world scale project, either in the same right of way to Kitimat or potentially trying to use Prince Rupert as the port? And there are distinctions between the two. Prince Rupert is probably harder to get to as a pipelining proposition, but it is open to the Pacific Ocean. Unlike Kitimat, which we've already found a way to get across the coastal gas or the coastal mountains. You get into Kitimat, but you still have significant more work to do to manage the channels into Kitimat that make it, a more, I'll just say, a more challenging marine exercise of getting the tankers to Kitimat as compared to Prince Rupert. But those are the relative issues between the two. Regardless, there is an LNG opportunity for Canada in a world that increasingly wants to consume more natural gas, needs to do this for not just maintaining the integrity of existing electrical systems, but the basic potential for substituting some of that higher emissive coal for natural gas. So again, Canada has that opportunity, but it faces the same two of the three problems, emission caps and the perverse effects of that federal regulatory statute. And you could actually add the same decarbonizing constraint because when you make LNG, you produce more natural gas. So there are some incremental emissions related to the production and transmission of the natural gas. And then when you get to the LNG step, you do have to compress the gas into the liquid phase. That requires energy that almost always requires burning natural gas to create that energy. So again, it's a real simple choice for Mark Carney. Am I going to have am I going to have conflict and collision with Alberta, an Alberta led by Danielle Smith? on whether Alberta will be basically allowed by the federal government to fully develop this hydrocarbon opportunity versus trying to impose conditions that doesn't have that happen, and then still believe that there's other sources of the Canadian economy that can actually realistically grow to replace what could have been provided by the hydrocarbon sector. All of which is in the context of a still unresolved trade situation with Donald Trump, where one can expect, I think, if that continues to be difficult and it actually translates into higher levels of unemployment in central Canada, there will be even more tensions as to how Alberta will be expected to help cover the cost of whatever actions are taken by the federal government to like see people through this crisis on whether or not Canada comes out with an auto industry after Donald Trump sets his demands in place, or does it all break down because the cost to the United States citizens become unbearable and he has to pull back. But the point being made is there is a set of issues related to trade that Carney is going to want to mitigate. He needs money to do that. And where's he going to look to get it from? And it's doubly ironic if he's unwilling to let Alberta expand its hydrocarbon production. So I think, to me, this is the fundamental question that we're all really confronting, I think, as Albertans and as Canadians. But it's more acute here because, at the one hand, if Carney imposes net zero, well, that means, for all intents and purposes, we stop producing hydrocarbons, which is like untenable for Alberta to accept. On the other hand, from a Carney point of view, if I allow Alberta to develop these resources, then the idea of net zero is really even more impossible than it was to begin with, because this is all a game, really, I think from his point of view. What are we credibly doing that still advances that notion versus actually doing a fundamental reversal of policy?
Mm-hmm. Well, how much do timelines matter? I mean, the Alberta government has talked about net zero targets looking to 2050 or beyond. So, I mean, if we're going to pursue it, does it make a difference in terms of how quickly we mandate it, how we go about doing so?
Well, first of all, it makes no sense for Canada to be committed to net zero unless the other developed economies of the world are equally committed. And we know one economy is utterly indifferent to it, the one that matters the most, actually. Mm-hmm. In the United States. And I say that because regardless of however this trade dispute plays out, Canadian-U.S. economic integration is never going to be fundamentally unwound regardless of how frayed this gets. Having said that, 2050, in terms of whether net zero is still on the table, remains to be seen. There will be this collision between those who still see affordable energy as fundamental to the economic growth and the economic stability and political stability of really the world order versus those who insist that growing emissions are inexorably leading to higher levels of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, which will lead to various manifestations of climate-caused natural disaster, and no amount of adaptation can kind of mitigate that. Right. However, at the moment, people are marching with their feet. Oil demand is not going down. The ability to impose net zero mandates has proven to be very difficult. People can examine all the equivocations that Germany has now had, even in England, with a climate minister as even more, as I'll put it, just as committed to net zero as people like Gibault are in Canada. Even they have had to recognize that there are fundamental energy affordability issues in that country that they have to work around. And also, if they're going to have any chance of advancing it, England will have to rediscover nuclear energy because there are limitations to what renewables can provide, while at the same time still coming to terms with what their energy circumstances could be benefited by if they were to allow shale gas development within that country. So, I mean, there's tensions everywhere, but they all come back to the world is finding it increasingly difficult to get off hydrocarbons because they are fundamentally affordable and reliable. So the question for Canada is, do we just eschew this opportunity, or do we actually take the view that we are going to meet this market demand in a world where the people that we compete with and the markets we sell to are making no tangible movements towards net zero? So why would we indulge in this sort of economic self-destruction? And to me, that's really the point that as things play out, Danielle Smith has to make to Albertans and to Canadians and confront Carney.
It's interesting because, as you say, I mean, we're talking about opportunities that exist in both oil and in natural gas. Now, Mark Carney, it was interesting because he seems reluctant to push ahead with any kind of project that might have some provincial opposition, and that might include BC and say Northern Gateway or something like Northern Gateway. Whereas on LNG, I mean, BC is much more bullish, supportive of LNG. They've got their own resources to develop, as you say. We've got LNG Canada, there's Cedar LNG, wood fiber LNG. Should we be a little more optimistic about the prospect of LNG development, and where does that leave oil, do you think?
Well, oil is more valuable. Oil is more immediate, because if we were to simply, as a matter of national commitment, and I'll tell you what that would really mean, which is that the Prime Minister of Canada would say, yes, I will do everything to ensure that a Northern Gateway 2.0 is revived. Now, I understand that, the Premier is musing about Prince Rupert. My own view is going to Kitimat would make more sense. That, of course, confronts the Trudeau butts moratorium. Obviously, Carney is, I think, basically trying to resist that, and it's really by creating these conditions that make it impossible for it to be realized, without overtly saying I'm opposed to any expansion of Alberta's oil industry, let alone I really want it contracted. On the case of natural gas, it is somewhat, quote, easier, but the fact of the matter still remains, if Canada were to add 1, 2, or 3 world-scale LNG facilities on the West Coast, we would have incremental emissions. And, Carney would have to accept that. And there would be resistance from not just the other elements of his coalition, but he himself as to how he would rationalize that. But I concede, natural gas is an easier, it has somewhat less resistance, but it may not, but at the end of the day, it will still be very difficult. But moreover, there's more value in oil, and there's more immediacy to actually gain from building, what I would just call Northern Gateway 2.0, and then allowing the industry to add that extra million barrels and fill that pipe up. And it gives optionality both to Asia and existing American markets. And people should appreciate, this is heavy oil. Most of it is going to go into refineries uniquely designed to run on that kind of oil. And at the moment, Canada has a major, people should just always be conscious. Canada is like number 4 in the world in terms of oil production. Yeah. Adding another million barrels makes us even more elemental to and fundamental to the world oil supply. So, this is a real, it's an overused word, but this is a real existential choice for this country.
So what do you make then of this legislation that the Carney government has tabled, the idea of identifying projects that would be in the national interest, having a time frame, an ideal time frame of 2 years to get that approved? We've seen how long it takes to get pipelines approved and built in this country, but still, as you say, with some of the conditions around decarbonization, are you more optimistic now maybe than you were in previous years that we could see another pipeline built?
Some of us actually participated in the whole consultation process related to how that bill was originally put in place. So we're talking about the Impact Assessment Act, and Carney's legislation would provide some amendments. And in fact, the industry itself has, collectively sent letters before the election and has reiterated the positions. They want some fundamental change in that statute. Let me just make this point. Regardless of what the statute says, nothing is more important than actually trusting the federal government that it is committed to a project. You can write whatever legislation you want, but if the federal government is at the end of the day equivocal or even fundamentally opposed to incremental oil being produced in Canada, there's no statute is going to solve that problem. So yes, it is constructive, absolutely constructive, if you can get a definitive permit to do this project within 2 years after you've actually made the application. But people should remember, the private sector has to decide, do I want to take this risk on? Then they have to assemble like the application, and then the clock starts. So, you're talking really about 4 years, more than 2, to actually start this. And then you've got construction. All this would be accelerated if Carney would simply unequivocally say, we are committed to this national project. National, which then does imply that no one specific province has a veto on whether this project can go ahead or not, regardless of how the economic rents from that project are distributed between Alberta and other provinces. Now, in the case of natural gas, again, as you pointed out, BC enjoys as many of those rents as does Alberta through, natural gas production, which they are the major royalty collector. But having said that, yes, those are constructive amendments, Dave. But again, the issue for private capital will be, can I trust Mark Carney? Is he really committed to this? And can Danielle Smith trust him?
Yeah, there is. We talked about Donald Trump and the Trump factor in all of this. Certainly, he seems to want to see increased production in the U.S. At the same time, I think he wants to see lower prices, and maybe that could be somewhat at odds. But the question of Canadian imports to the U.S. This was the same president who approved Keystone XL. Now seems to say he doesn't want Canadian oil. So how does all of that factor in?
Well, just make 2 points. The American refining industry knows the value of Canadian heavy oil.
Right. That
industry collectively, I think, did have impact on the fact that when Trump was applying tariffs on Canada, tariffs on Alberta oil were at 10%. Tariffs on Alberta and BC natural gas were at 10%. Now, they may today be zero in the interim until they have to come to the next deadline on whether they are exempted because of the USMCA. But the point is, there was a recognition that the adjustments that Donald Trump wants out of Canada do not relate to energy. In fact, the integration of continental energy, I think, is something that he is not fundamentally at odds with. Because in fact, that say we do produce this extra 1 million barrels and someone was to then put into play, well, instead of building the pipe to the West Coast and dealing with all the environmental risks of the Douglas Channel, let's just revive KXL and send it all to the Gulf Coast. That is more difficult in such an environment where his actions related to other significant portions of the Canadian economy. And make no mistake, I think he does have an agenda that at its most brutal, is pointed at the continuance of a Canadian auto industry. Because I think he is obviously, he has never claimed issues with Saskatchewan potash, Quebec hydroelectric, or Alberta oil. So, Trump is a problem in terms of an overall trade situation that should never have been provoked. But it got Carney elected, and he is the human being that basically is leading this country that Alberta has to deal with.
Should we, if it was on the table, if Keystone XL was back on the table, though, is that something Canada should say yes to still?
Well, first of all, I come from this proposition. Whether we're talking about Northern Gateway 2.0 or revived KXL or some other oil-related export project, although in my own mind, I dismiss any revivals of Energy East. That should be, in the first instance, determined by private capital. Which of those options does private capital believe provides the greatest economy, coupled with which has the least, quote, regulatory and political risk? Well, at the moment, both of them are dead in the water if you're really serious about net zero. But assuming you're open to that possibility, my first test is which of those two projects would attract private sector support. And I mean, it would be true that if the Northern Gateway option did acquire that private sector support, and what that really means is, are the oil sands producers willing to financially commit to new pipeline infrastructure and allow entities like DC, like South Bow or Enbridge or other entities that can be assembled to do this kind of a project? Would they value the economics to be better one relative to the other? And would they believe that they could actually get a commitment from this federal government that they are prepared to back it? Now, just in respect of KXL, KXL is less disruptive to Canada because we basically had the permits in hand for that section. So there's a relatively less environmental impact in just the physics of building the pipe. However, you have the same incremental emissions that you'd have to get over whether it goes to Asia or the U.S., and it implies more economic integration with the U.S. So again, the federal government might have a real preference for diversification. In fact, that was one of Carney's 4 positions. He phrased it rather obliquely, referring to autonomy and robustness, I think. But my own view is, which of those two would garner private sector support? I would tend to follow the lead, whichever that was the case. My own sense is it is more likely to be in the form of a West Coast oil pipeline as the next increment, not a revival of KXL. That would be my own intuition today.
Yeah. We'll see where this all goes. Some big decisions that we have to make as a country for sure. Dennis McConaghy, appreciate the conversation and the insight on all of this. Thanks again for making some time for us here.
Thank you, Rob.
Okay, there you go. That is Dennis McConaghy. He's a former top executive at TC Energy, the author of multiple books on Canada's energy debate and energy future. His most recent is called Carbon Change, Canada on the Brink of Decarbonization. Speaking of authors, coming up shortly, we're going to hear from Paul Palango, investigative journalist and author of the new book, Anatomy of a Cover-Up, the truth about the RCMP and the Nova Scotia Massacres. Of course, we just passed the 5-year anniversary of the massacre, which was the largest mass murder in Canada's history, but still many questions around how that all went down. So we'll hear from Paul Palango coming up shortly. In just a moment here, we're going to get the latest on the ArriveCAN app scandal. Remember the ArriveCAN app, of course, the federal government developed this during the pandemic. We subsequently learned just how much it cost to build this app and how useless it turned out to be. Well, Canada's Auditor General with some new findings around all of this. We'll recap that for you in just a moment. My name is Rob Breakenridge. We're back after this. Welcome back. You're listening to the Rob Breakenridge Show. This is episode 8. We got some news this week concerning the ArriveCAN scandal. I wanted to revisit this. Some important new findings from Canada's Auditor General, not just around the ArriveCAN app itself, not just the company that developed the app, but the awarding of government contracts and just how problem-plagued that whole process seems to be and what that's ultimately costing taxpayers. Now, the ArriveCAN app itself, you recall the government developed this or put this out during the pandemic. So it was about 3 years ago, and it was intended for cross-border travelers. You were supposed to use the app if you were leaving Canada and then, as the name implies, arriving back in Canada. Now, initially, this was supposed to cost about $80,000, a relatively straightforward app. That seems about right. Somehow, we ended up spending $60 million on this. And as it turned out, the app didn't work all that well and wasn't used for all that long. So it just seemed like a tremendous waste of money. So how exactly did the federal government manage to screw that up so badly? So we've learned a lot more about it. One of the concerns that have been raised is how this tiny little company, GC Strategies, got the contract in the first place. And so there have been all kinds of questions around that. So what we got this week in her latest report, Auditor General Karen Hogan, looking at how contracts are being awarded. Now, this involves contracts to this same company. And all kinds of examples of contracts being awarded, she says, without performing basic checks, such as ensuring the requested work was done or the contractors had proper security clearance. She says it's pretty clear from what she found there's all kinds of problems with the way in which the federal government verifies that it gets value for money. So this is a big problem, to say the least. Here's a little bit of what Auditor General Karen Hogan had to say about her findings.
What we found here is that public servants were not applying procurement rules that at times are very clear. This echoed findings that I had in my previous audit on ArriveCan, as well as a previous audit on professional services that focused in on McKinsey and Company. I said it back then, and I'll repeat it now. I have no reason to believe that this is unique to two vendors. And that's why I believe the government needs to take a step back and look at why this behavior is happening. And is it that there are just too many rules that just keep getting added on audit after audit so that folks don't understand all of the rules? Or are people trying to go around them to make the process faster? Either way, the rules are meant to support transparency and accountability, and I would expect that those basic elements are followed by public servants.
Given the investigations you've done so far on McKinsey and GC strategies, do you have a sense at this point of how widespread these issues are in the public service?
Well, I can only speak to those two elements, and in both cases, the vendors represented a really small percentage of what was spent on professional services contracts by the federal government. But in the McKinsey work, we had looked at 10 Crown corporations and 10 departments. In this audit, there's 31 federal organizations, including one Crown and departments. And we found issues in almost every contract that we looked at, which tells me that there's no reason to believe it's limited to these two. And it's time for the public service to go back to the basics and understanding procurement rules and why they should be followed.
Okay, so that's Canada's Auditor General Karen Hogan talking about some of her findings. In response to this report, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, speaking with reporters this week, reiterating that there needs to be some accountability within the government for this. The ministers who were responsible for ArriveCan are still ministers in this government. But more to the point, we have not recouped the money that was spent. Is it possible to get this money back? Here's what Pierre Poilievre had to say.
Today's Auditor General's report, which I have today in my hands, are a chronicle of Liberal incompetence and an orgy of Liberal waste. We have here GC Strategies. The company the Liberals gave over 100 separate contracts from 31 different departments, which is under RCMP investigation. The contracts were for IT, even though GC Strategies does not actually do IT work. We all remember this is the same contractor that did the unnecessary and useless COVID app that was way over budget and could have been completed for a fraction of the cost. We now know that in other contracts, the government overpaid. They often didn't even check what the market rate was for the services that they were buying. Quote, actions of the federal government frequently did not demonstrate value for money. Federal government made payments without evidence that all the deliverables were received. Translation, they paid even when they didn't see that the job was done. So 46% of the contracts examined, there was no evidence that the work was completed, and yet the government paid for it. It'd be like if you walked into a restaurant, you were never served a meal, but you paid the bill anyway and added a big tip and sent off the bill to the taxpayer. That's what Liberals have done with your money in this case. So now, who's responsible? Well, Public Safety Minister LeBlanc was at the time, Public Safety Minister who helped get these contracts out. Now he's been promoted in the Liberal government. You've got Patty Hajdu, who was the Health Minister that kicked off the ArriveCan app. She as well has been promoted. So it is the same Liberal ministers, the same Liberal gang, making the same Liberal mistakes that cost Canadians a fortune. And that is why we are calling for accountability. We're calling on the government to get our money back. They need to go to GC Strategies and get our money back so taxpayers can be made whole. We must ensure our government spends money wisely.
Okay, so that's Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre reacting to the latest findings from Canada's Auditor General regarding contracts awarded to GC Strategies, which of course included the ArriveCan app, which truly was a debacle. And no, I don't think there's been accountability. I don't know that the government has learned from this. And certainly at this point, taxpayers have not been able to recoup any of that money. So we'll see if anything changes in light of this latest report and some important findings from the Auditor General. Okay, when we come back, an interesting new book, an important new book regarding the Nova Scotia Massacre of April 2020. So we're just past the 5-year anniversary of what turned out to be the largest mass murder in Canada's history. Gabriel Wortman murdered 22 people across 2 days before he was shot dead himself by police. But there have been all kinds of questions about how the RCMP handled this in the lead up to the massacre, while the massacre was occurring, and of course, the aftermath. Paul Palango is an investigative journalist. He has been following this for 5 years, written extensively about all of this, and is the author of a new book. It's called Anatomy of a Cover-Up, The Truth About the RCMP and the Nova Scotia Massacres. We'll hear from him right after this. It's been 5 years now since Gabriel Wortman murdered 22 people across 2 days in northern Nova Scotia, the largest mass murder in Canada's history. Still, many questions remain about how it all played out over those 2 days and what police knew and did before, during, and after the bloodshed. Paul Palango is an author and investigative journalist. He has written extensively about the massacre that was handled and investigated by authorities. He's the author of 22 Murders, Investigating the Massacres, Cover-Up, and Obstacles to Justice in Nova Scotia. His latest, the follow-up, published this month by Penguin Random House. It's called Anatomy of a Cover-Up, The Truth About the RCMP and the Nova Scotia Massacres. Paul Palango, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Hey, good to be back, Rob.
Well, let me ask you this question, because this book is about trying to find the truth. Is it still possible, do you think, at this point, to really fully understand and document the truth of what happened over those days?
I think, well, I've been doing this for 5 years, along with some citizen investigators. And it was quite clear from the beginning, before the Mass Casualty Commission even sat, I wrote 22 Murders. And note, I put in the subtitle, The Cover-Up and the Obstacles to Justice, because I sensed this is what they were doing. The evidence told me they were doing this, and I wanted to force the Mass Casualty Commission, the federal provincial public inquiry set up to investigate it, to deal with all the people and all the scenarios I raised, that I knew they would hide it and come up with a false narrative. And I sat there, and then we spent more than a year going through all the documents. And so how do we prove this? It's the negative proof in large measure. You know what the negative proof is? You take what is purported to be the truth, and in their narrative, take their narrative as the truth and prove it wrong.
Right.
So I proved it wrong in this book, Anatomy of a Cover-Up, time and time again. Which means if their truth is not the truth, there's another truth out there. And I suggest and actually prove what some of the other stories are. But what this whole thing is, one of my citizen investigators, Ryan Potter, he said the other day as he was going through the book, which just came out today officially, he went through the book and he says, imagine this thing as a train trip that begins before the massacres in 2020, through the massacres and up till now. And the train stops at a bunch of stations along the way over the years. Every stop, he said, there's a screw up. There's something not right. The story's not right. He says every single one of them. So the narrative was shaped, and what I've done is sort of disassemble that narrative and provide you with clues to what the real narrative is.
What do you think then is so damaging or embarrassing or even scandalous about the truth?
I think there are so many issues that they're hiding. I think the number one issue that I always suspected was that Gabriel Wortman, the shooter, was a confidential informant for the RCMP or an agent. We don't know, but they're not, the government's not allowed to tell you or admit he was, even after he's died. That was one thing to cover up. But then all the debacles that happened during the 13-and-a-half-hour murder spree, at every stop along the way, something happened. And they covered it up and massaged the story to make it look like to give the RCMP a semblance of heroism.
Well, it's about why the truth matters here, right? Because 22 people were murdered that day. And so it's not just a question about how it was handled after the fact. The before and during are about where lives are on the line here. And did 22 people need to die? Like, this really cuts to maybe the most important question here, right, Paul? That did these people, or did all of them, really need to die here?
No, certainly not. I mean, one of the key witnesses, the way I tell the story is that 16 people who were very close to Gabriel Wortman were excluded from being examined in public at the Mass Casualty Commission out of fear of further traumatizing them. Right. But when you go through their evidence, that's where the real story seems to lie. And one of those witnesses is a Halifax cop who gave a statement and shortly after the massacres, and he was a friend of Wortman's. And in that, he says Wortman was not going to give his money to anyone. He wasn't doing all this stuff. He didn't think he was going to die. He said Wortman was a guy who was essentially, there's one word missing in what he said. It's sort of inaudible, but it could only mean he was a dead man walking in Canada is essentially what he was saying. He had to get away. He planned to fake his own death. Something went wrong. And I firmly believe that's the story. I've always believed that was the story. But I eventually found it in the evidence that they buried, that Wortman was. So if you take that scenario, well, how did he know that? And why was Wortman a dead man walking? And from the beginning, I connected this to him having his cover blown, when that the Hells Angels or some group like that were after him.
But why did he do it? Why did he kill so many people? Can we ever really fully understand that?
I don't know if we can really understand it. I think the key to that is his so-called common law wife. And if you read the book, you'll see why I say so-called. I think she knows, and she's been entirely protected by the system. Nobody's allowed to ask a question of her, a really meaningful question. She's never been cross-examined. And she's been considered a victim from the beginning. And I spent 4 chapters essentially laying out the real story as far as I can see it.
I want to talk about the public inquiry, the Mass Casualty Commission that was set up, that was supposed to be about getting to the truth. And I guess maybe in some ways, some of the documents it produced, it did shed a lot of light on what happened. But what was this whole exercise in your view?
Like many public inquiries in Canada over the last 40 years, it was used as a public policy tool to engineer public opinion, sort of to manufacture consent to the story. So the RCMP original story was, it was a domestic violence case gone wrong, and this man went off his rocker. And then the Mass Casualty Commission did everything it could to make that story work. And I spent 500 pages showing you that that wasn't the story.
Where was it of some value, though? Because as you detail in the book, a lot of your investigative work sort of started from information that emerged through the commission, or documents that emerged through the commission. Did it help at least open up avenues of investigation?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we did a book launch party on Sunday, and it struck me when I was talking that the RCMP and the justice system is really good at manufacturing stories. The RCMP likes to say, likes to promote its ability to do Mr. Big Stings and get criminals and lure them into these fantastic scenarios. And it struck me that what we did is I took a bunch of ordinary people who are forgotten, otherwise ignored, and turned them into investigators, willing investigators who worked on their own time. And we did like a Mr. Little sting on the police, the government, and the justice system. And we essentially played them, set them up, made them produce documents. Then we showed that we could penetrate the RCMP, the DOJ, the Mass Casualty Commission, get things out. So let them know that you better produce things because we're going to find them. And so they didn't know what we didn't know or what we did know. So they had to produce documents. Then they massaged the narrative, hid those documents. Then we spent a year going through the record. And it's like 1 million words in the last report, probably 2 million words and graphs in the underlying documents. Very difficult to search, but we went through them and we found some smoking guns.
What stood out to you then in terms of what you found that might have even come as a surprise to you?
Well, one of the lingering questions was the murder of Corey Ellison, who was visiting his father at Portapique that Saturday night in April 18th, 2020. And his brother Clinton, people who remember this incident remember his brother Clinton and being interviewed the next day or day after about hiding in the woods for 4 hours and being hunted down and stuff like this. And afterwards, Clinton Ellison would say, I think the Mounties killed my brother. And then he had some issues, and then he would say, oh, no, I apologize. And then he'd go back, I think they killed my brother. Well, the evidence we've gone through seriously makes the case that Gabriel Wortman did not kill Corey Ellison.
Wow.
And if he did not kill Corey Ellison, who killed Corey Ellison? And by going through everything, it looks like the Mounties accidentally shot Corey Ellison. That's the argument I can make. And that's one of the things they had to cover up that night.
Well, and as you go through it and you detail what witnesses were saying, what was on the 911 calls, all of the evidence, it was a lot of panic. It was a lot of confusion. It was a very unorganized response. And I guess in part, maybe that's where sort of the embarrassment comes for the RCMP is how they handled all of this.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I had a former deputy commissioner of the RCMP call me shortly after it happened and said, this is the worst day in the history of the RCMP, and this is likely the end of the force. That's how dramatic that was, if people forget. And so the system rallied around the RCMP to protect them and create a narrative that Canadians would buy, much like they've done in the past with other public inquiries. Not get to the answer that was right, but get to the answer the government wanted to be right. And in this case, they shaped the narrative to probably cover up the shooting of who really shot Corey Ellison. There needs to be an investigation there, and we will pursue that. Another thing they did, Rob, about 2 years after the murder of Constable Heidi Stevenson, who was the 20th victim of Wortman, the RCMP and the Mass Casualty Commission came up with a scenario that Heidi Stevenson actually got out of her car and fired 14 shots and was involved in a heroic gun battle with Wortman and actually wounded Wortman, and that's how he was identified eventually. I went through all the evidence, and I was writing in this book that I don't believe that happened. And as I was double checking the records, I came across a document, an exchange of documents between the then head of the RCMP, the chief operations officer, Chief Superintendent Chris Leather, and the interim head of the Serious Incident Response Team, the police watchdog. And in that exchange, it shows how the RCMP admitted she had been executed. And then after the RCMP union said, oh, she rammed Wortman and took him off the road, that didn't happen. And then the RCMP came up with this scenario that, well, maybe she wounded Joey Weber, the 21st victim, and there should be an investigation of this. And the interim director, Pat Curran, sent the shirty letter back to the RCMP 2 or 3 days after the massacre saying, essentially, how dare you? I'm not going to try to prove there was a gunfight that didn't happen. Right. You said, in your own words on Sunday, as you investigated it, that she was executed. And 27 witnesses, well, most of the 27 witnesses never saw her get out of her car. So this raises questions about planted evidence and things like that. So this was never really investigated by the MCC. But they needed a hero, and they decided to make Heidi Stevenson a hero when she was put into a situation she shouldn't have been put into. 19 people were dead. It'd been going on for 12 and a half hours, and she was alone in her car. Yeah. The RCMP needed to, and she was not very well trained, even though she'd been on the force 25 years. She'd failed all her carbine testing, and in fact had been kicked out of the class and wasn't allowed to even apply anymore. So she wasn't tactically sound. She was alone on her own, and she was killed. So instead of admitting that and getting into it, the governments, the Nova Scotian federal government, DOJ, and the RCMP decided to turn her into a hero with what looks to me like a fabricated story.
Yeah. What do we know about Wortman's end, or the end of this part of the timeline and his death? Do we have a clear picture of how that unfolded?
As I said before, we penetrated all the organizations and sort of made them very paranoid about what was going on, so they'd look screwy at each other. And one of the things we uncovered through a source we developed called True Blue were videotapes showing the execution of Wortman. And the RCMP, again, promoted the hero story that 2 Mounties stumbled onto Wortman and identified him by the wound on his head from Heidi Stevenson's bullet that was never fired. He got the wound somewhere else. Said that they recognized Heidi Stevenson's gun in his hand, et cetera, et cetera. And we were able to show that. And the Mass Casualty Commission, this is what they did, Rob, to understand how this worked. The whole incident involving the shooting of Wortman, from the time the RCMP vehicle stops till the first shots are fired with the officer outside the car, 2 officers outside the car firing, is 5.5 seconds. And when the MCC analyzed that tape, it took them more than an hour, probably 2 hours, because they went frame by frame by frame to make it look like it took longer time than it did. And then when we at Frank Magazine went to court to get that all those documents out and to get all the film, they still did not produce it all. But what they did do was deflect the media's attention away from that story by having Brenda Lucky accused of political interference in the investigation. So Brenda Lucky became the story. She resigned, and this story disappeared from the public view.
How close was Wortman to getting away, though, do you think?
He seemed to think, if you look at Barry Warnell's testimony, he seems to think that he was going to get away. Because one of the things, they said, he went on this mad rampage and he started killing people after a fight with his girlfriend. But he had a brick of $20,000 in the back of his car, changes of clothing, and a bunch of other things. He looked like he thought he was getting away until he wasn't. And I think the RCMP and the MCC covered up all kinds of things, that he had a phone or a radio. He knew what the police were going. They never got in front of him over 13 and a half hours, which makes me think that he was in contact with someone right from the beginning, or all through it, that he was in contact with someone, and they never admit that he has a phone or a radio. And I show in one sequence, there's a really interesting sequence where Wortman's buddy, Rob Doucette, who later threatened to kill me and then got convicted of that. Rob Doucette was being interviewed by the police. He came forward because he was concerned about what was going on. And in the interview of him by someone who was a Halifax cop who was part of the RCMP Halifax Joint Forces, was asking him questions. And when Rob said something that was indicated he was pointing at something that might be very, very, might have linked him to the police, the interview stops. He's, I got to go get a coffee. Then he comes back. And in this one instance, he comes back from being away and he says, next question. He goes, anything else you want to say, Rob? And Rob goes, he had a phone. It was an Android phone, and he kept it in the door of his truck, and his wife didn't even know about it.
Wow.
And know what the cop's response was? Excuse me, I got to take another break. Comes back and then changes the subject. And this happens. I show this time and time again with the interviewing process, how the story was never pursued at any level. So as I said, it's the negative proof, Rob. If you can prove their story is wrong, that means there's another truth out there. And from the evidence we've seen, you can infer that truth is Wortman was an informant and something was wrong there, and it was like a blown operation.
Your thoughts on the community and those impacted by this. And as you point out, I mean, look, there are some who think maybe you're digging too much, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of people, families included, who want answers, who are frustrated by how this has all been handled. You've got accounts of witnesses who say, well, I said this to the police and they ignored me, or they didn't listen to this part, or they ignored that part. So clearly there are people who deserve to know and want to know what happened here.
Well, the families, like almost the witnesses at the Irving Big Stop, the family members, all were forced to sign NDAs
right.
with the government, non-disclosure agreements. They avoid me like the plague because their financial interest in the long run is cooperating with the government. And a lot of the families don't want to get to the bottom of it because there's things there that are a little messy. But my point of this from the beginning was, I'm not there. I'm there for the dead, to get justice for the dead, but it's also a public policy issue. It's the integrity of the RCMP and the institutions of Canada and what is going on. I mean, Canada, in my mind, has largely been shaped by public policy that is not based on the facts. It's based, public inquiries that have shaped debate and shaped policy that maybe we should have gone in another direction. And this one, where they basically said, the RCMP should be taken out of contract policing, but none of that is getting done. They don't really mean it. They're still trying to hold on to this federal police force operating with federal rules as provincial and municipal police. And they're not accountable. And this shows that they're not accountable.
Well, and that's what I wanted to ask, Paul. I mean, has anything actually really changed? The MCC was supposed to not just tell us what happened, which maybe they didn't do, but to bring about some real fundamental change. But it just feels like if this happened today, the massacre happened today, what would be different?
No, there's been nothing different. I mean, the RCMP is still selling itself as a contract police force, even though it's now lost its biggest contract in Surrey, BC, and it's lost Grand Prairie. Kelowna's they're now their biggest one. Is threatening to go to its own municipal police force. It's falling apart across the country. They can't attract members, and even now, local and provincial authorities everywhere are saying, well, they're not really accountable, are they? We have no control over them. And that doesn't make for a good police service in any community.
So what do you hope this book and your work can accomplish? Like, where do we go from here, do you think, Paul?
Well, number one, this is still not the end, because this book proves that what they were saying was not true in almost every case. They made things up. They made stories up. They ignored witnesses, manipulated the evidence. Number one, I think that, if you wanted to go to, modern true crime series, who killed Corey Ellison? I think Wortman may have killed 20 or 21 people. 2 of the deaths I'm suspicious of. And so is the community, many members of the community. About 5 weeks ago, after the book was done, I had someone contact me who had been contacting me over the years. I didn't realize their connection. And then they got back to me a few minutes after contacting me and saying, my cousin was at Portapique, one of the police there. And my other cousin and I believe that our cousin shot Corey Ellison. Do you know that? And I said, well, I've gone through the evidence, and I think I know who you're talking about. And it turned out it was. That's out there, and I think that's worth pursuing in the public interest. Secondly, I continue to believe the RCMP, we need new federal policing, an independent force in Canada, and provincial and municipal police forces that are run by the provinces and municipalities that are accountable to those local jurisdictions. Otherwise, our police system is screwed up, and it's not good public policy. It's time for a change.
Yeah. The book is out now, as mentioned. It's called Anatomy of a Cover-Up, The Truth About the RCMP and the Nova Scotia Massacres. Paul Palango, thank you so much for making some time for us here. Really appreciate this.
Anytime, Rob. Thank you.
All right, there you go. That is author, investigative journalist Paul Palango. His latest book, it's called Anatomy of a Cover-Up, The Truth About the RCMP and the Nova Scotia Massacres. Also, our thanks to Dennis McConaghy, former top executive at TC Energy, the author of multiple books on Canada's energy conversation and energy future. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those issues coming up on the next episode of the podcast, which will drop for you on Tuesday. We're going to hear from Heather Exner-Perot, who's a senior fellow, director of energy, natural resources, and environment at MacDonald Laurier Institute, also a special advisor to the Business Council of Canada and research advisor to the Indigenous Resource Network. So more on some of these conversations coming up on our next episode. We'll also talk about the big G7 summit that is happening in Alberta. Rob Hubert at the University of Calgary, also interim director at the Centre for Military Security and Strategic Studies. We'll talk about some of the foreign policy, defense policy issues going into this summit. And of course, comes on the heels of the big announcement from the Prime Minister that Canada is going to ramp up military spending and meet that 2% NATO target this year. Don't forget, you can follow us, subscribe at our Substack page, robbreakenridge.ca. We got more on our YouTube channel, and you can listen and subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and elsewhere. Thanks so much for spending some time with us on this episode. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, folks, and we will talk to you on Tuesday. Take care.